अस्सलाम वालेकुम नाज़रीन, मैं हूं आपकी होस्ट अर्शिया शुएब ख्वाजा और आज हम आपको एक नए प्रोग्राम में वेलकम करते हैं। आज के हमारे गेस्ट हैं मोहम्मद मुनीब कादिर साहब, जो हैं ही इज़ एन एडवोकेट ऑफ द लाहौर हाई कोर्ट. He has an LLM from Queen's Mary University in Intellectual Property Law. He has done his LLB honours from the University of London. उसके बाद वो कॉलमिस्ट भी हैं द न्यूज़ इंटरनेशनल के लिए, ह्यूमन राइट्स एक्टिविस्ट भी हैं, लिखते हैं ऑन ह्यूमन राइट्स एंड वेरियस अदर इंटरनेशनल लॉ इश्यूज़, प्रैक्टिसिंग लॉयर हैं. और आज हम उनके साथ जिस टॉपिक पे बात करेंगे, और उन्होंने एक इंटरनेशनल रोल भी पाकिस्तानी मीडिया के लिए प्ले किया है कि वो इंडियन मीडिया पे प्रो पाकिस्तानी स्टांस लेके भी उन्होंने काफ़ी शोज़ में पार्टिसिपेट किया है. और आज हम उनके साथ बात करेंगे ऑन ग्लोबलाइजेशन, nationalism and the relevance of human rights law. Assalamu alaikum sir, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Sir, I would want to ask you that in an increasingly globalized world, how do you think that human rights can, the doctrine and the ideology of human rights, to what extent is it valid and it can be effectively implemented within nation states?
Too many strands to your question, in fact, and this complex question in one particular, manner of speaking, in the sense that there are a lot of ways of defining what human rights are even. There's a debate as to whether human rights, is it even a universal concept, or is it something which is more culturally relative, to get the classic universalism versus cultural relativism debate.
Definitely.
And also, I believe that within the context of globalization, now you've got that element as well. Jab hum baat kar rahe hain of human rights in a globalized world, in a world where it's just a click away, of course, then there are very many new challenges which come up every now and then. And again, globalization implies that there is one single set of human rights. कि human rights का एक ही idea है on which there is universal agreement, but somehow there has been a lot of argument and a of sorts between वो जो कहते हैं the north and south division. You've got the developed world and then you've got the third world countries as they call them, and the third world countries relatively argue that human rights vary from culture, and that is something I believe that we see in our own country as well. Whenever there's a debate which springs up, चाहे वो feminist movement के बारे में हो, women's rights movement, what we saw, during the Aurat March movement, which has sort of become an annual ritual, कि जब Aurat March movement आ रही होती है, तो you've got the right wing and the right wing media, the majority of it, who are very much opposed to the whole concept, and the feminist movement is completely alien to them. And on the other hand, you've got those people who are there to their concept of human rights, which is much more, I believe, in unison with what is come to be known as international human rights, and with the UN globalized system, and all in line with the specific treaties that Pakistan is also state party to. So, वो जो एक clash आता है, and something which even our Prime Minister, Mr. Imran Khan, alluded to, when he said, especially referring to Aurat March movement, and he said कि ये अब नजर आ रहा है that there is a cultural divide between people of different strata of society. So globalized world में फिर ये challenges हो जाते हैं कि we define human rights but from whose point of view. But in theory, now that's the interesting bit. In theory, आप चाहे ICCPR उठाकर देख लें, यानी the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, या International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, या उसी तरह से Universal Declaration of Human Rights, या various, again Pakistan is state party to all of these instruments that I'm naming here, या CEDAW, the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. इस सब के अंदर जो कैटलॉग ऑफ ह्यूमन राइट्स दिए गए हैं, your basic civil and political rights, freedom of liberty, freedom of thought, conscience, freedom of expression, या even economic and social and cultural rights. Pakistani constitution अब देख लें, the content is very similar.
Yes, indeed.
Between, these international human rights instruments and Pakistani constitution, or for that matter, the American constitution or the Indian constitution. But then why is it that there is so much variance and so many debates going on continuously when it comes to the implementation stage? Waha we do not see that kind of universal agreement which we see on paper. तो ये जब तक नहीं decide हो सकता कि in this globalized world where we've started to call it a global village, and now that I've just mentioned internet has brought us all very much closer, more so now that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. So up to nation states have to coordinate their strategies with one another, and also from education to business deals to international summits, they're all taking place online, just as our conversation right now is happening through Zoom. तो इस पूरे कॉन्टेक्स्ट में अगर हम देखें, can particular countries or can particular communities really say that human rights is not a universal concept when it is quite clear that we are bound to interact with one another, and we somehow manage to surmount all the boundaries and all sorts of geographical divide. So इस context के अंदर when we start talking about human rights, सबसे पहले क्वेश्चन आता है who gets to define it and why should human rights be universal if that is the argument. कि अगर हम कहते हैं नहीं ये चीजें बेसिक हैं, right to life, your liberty should be protected so far as you are not posing any physical threat to someone else or you are not propagating violence, then
the notion of correlative rights, बिल्कुल, absolutely,
that is the universalist notion of human rights. Yes. Right, कि you are free to do whatever you want to until and unless you are not encroaching on to someone else's rights.
Indeed.
अब अगर ये understanding आ जाए तो then that is the question. Why focus so much on individual liberties and why not focus on, for example, owing duties to one another? Why are we talking about only entitlements in the context of rights? And why are we not speaking of owing duties and taking on responsibilities?
That is the problem, that when we do interpret human rights theoretically even, we ignore the duty aspect of it. We just focus on the liberties. But then again, as you said, that there are a lot of debates and arguments about the implementation of these rights. Theoretically, the impetus of the entire international human rights project was to bring the human family closer together. यानी आप इंसानों को करीब ला रहे हैं. उसके अंदर ऑब्वियसली जिन नेशन स्टेट्स में वो इंसान रह रहे हैं उनका एक रोल है, बिकॉज उन्हीं नेशन स्टेट्स ने वो उनको देने हैं राइट्स और वो उनकी ड्यूटी है. But then again, when we talk about implementation, I think the problems arise when different governments, when they come in, they are not ingrained and united on the issue of implementation of human rights. हर नई गवर्नमेंट जो आती है उसका अपना एक जो है वो मैनिफेस्टो होता है, जिसपे वो मैनिफेस्टो भी खैर कितना ही होता है वो दैट इज़ समथिंग डिफरेंट, बट मैनिफेस्टो होता है जिसपे वो काम कर रही होती है. और अनफॉर्चुनेटली मोस्ट ऑफ द टाइम शायद इम्प्लीमेंटेशन ऑफ ह्यूमन राइट्स इज़ नॉट अ पार्ट ऑफ इट. But
also there's a lot of disagreement, by the way. New governments, successive governments, they really do keep on coming in. But what happens when human rights conflict, for example, when there are communal rights as a community, like you just said, कि duties की बात नहीं करते. I say, if we've started talking about duties, चलो शुरू कर दी duties की बात. Now, what if, for instance, we've been seeing in African countries, there have been a lot of practices which are justified under the pretext of culture, but they are, for example, very harmful to the most vulnerable or women. Yeah, in a lot of communities, indigenous people. कि अगर आप कह रहे हो that one particular individual is subject to communal practices or cultural practices within a particular tradition of a particular society, and if that person wants to opt out of that particular tradition or culture, that person says that this is my freedom of liberty. This is exactly where I'm saying cultural rights versus individual rights.
Yeah.
Communal rights versus individual rights. What should prevail? ये भी बहुत बड़ी disagreement है, because interestingly जब human rights violation होती हैं, so to speak, वो भी states do not violate human rights saying कि we are all out on violating human rights. वो कहते हैं ये human rights का हिस्सा है.
वो कल्चर हमारे कल्चर का पार्ट है, वो हमारे ट्रेडिशंस का पार्ट है
and cultural rights का पार्ट है. So you have to balance your individual rights with both of them. But unfortunately, then this also becomes a pretext for human rights abuse.
It's a loophole within the law. It's a loophole within the law, which is unfortunate. But then again, maybe this loophole was left to actually make states agree upon human right projects. वरना तो शायद ये हमारे पास documents भी ना होते. Because then again, it is nation states which came together at the United Nations and created them.
Interestingly, and before moving on to the next question, if you look at the colonial times, and of course we were British colony, but I'm not just talking about Asia or Southeast Asia, but also Latin America.
Yeah.
Interestingly, जो उस वक्त के theorists होते थे, they used to, including John Locke.
Yeah.
Interestingly, when they used to advance, their theories of human rights, they used to explain human rights in such a way so as to justify colonization and colonialism.
Indeed.
And these are the Western states, by the way, जिसका आज हम लोगों को कहा जाता है ये तो Western concept आ गया human rights का. Every single time, पाकिस्तान के अंदर हमें कोई कहता है ना कि ये तो Western concept है human rights वगैरह, हमारे culture के साथ नहीं है. मेरा job उनको ये होता है that you are overestimating human rights in the Western world, much beyond they deserve. Much more than they deserve, because interestingly, उस वक्त rights of property, rights of liberty, of freedom of movement के pretext के अंदर colonialism को justify किया था Western powers ने. So again, it becomes a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
So even if we agree on paper, it is the implementation stage where disagreement comes in.
Exactly.
And human rights abuse, then they set in. Yeah.
Sir, before we move on, I would like to ask you, can you please explain our audience the difference between humanitarian and human rights law? Because generally when we come across programs or anchors, तो ज़्यादातर जो guests भी आते हैं, they keep on referring to human rights, but वो actually humanitarian law की बात कर रहे होते हैं. And mostly people who are not technically aware about these issues, उनको पता नहीं होता. So if you could please allude a bit between the difference of international humanitarian law and human rights.
I'm very glad that you're asking this question, actually, because I understand that, the human part in human rights law and humanitarian law, that is where the overlap occurs. And also, I believe in practice, there are a lot of overlaps, because I'll tell you, so human rights as a concept means the human rights that people hold, individuals hold, subjects or citizens hold, and ultimately then global citizens against their nation states. So somehow human rights law के अंदर the idea is that, the nemesis or the particular potential human rights violator is the state. And so it is the state which is going to protect your rights. And I think that there's a lot of paradox here as well. Okay, when you're telling us that, state has the ability to violate human rights, hence state is under the duty to protect human rights. So आपने एक ही in a single breath you said that, the violator is the protector and the protector is the violator.
Yeah.
And that is where the paradox sets in. But human rights law I think, अगर मैं बहुत ही इसको simplistic terms में समझाना चाहूँ, although it's not a simple concept at all, but in abstract, if I want to speak of human rights or international human rights law, the crux of it is that the obligation falls upon states to protect human rights, and these are catalog of rights or entitlements which individuals have, or individuals, when you group them together, collectively have against the state. So these range from civil and political rights all the way to what are now known as, inaccurately so, but second generation rights, including economic, social and cultural rights, which then bring us to third generation rights, जिसके अंदर group rights भी आ जाते हैं. But all these rights, even if they vary from civil and political to economic and social, all these rights are ultimately held against the state, and under traditional understanding of international human rights law, then individuals or non-state actors or private corporates, for example, they are not the ones who are duty bearers. They are not the ones who are tasked with ensuring or protecting human rights. It is ultimately the state which has the duty to respect and the duty to ensure within the wording of ICCPR that these human rights are made available to people. International humanitarian law, on the other hand, is a much more recent concept, especially, it's much more of a post-second concept, which in a way paves the way in for international criminal law.
Yes.
So international humanitarian law के जो subjects हैं, उसकी range के within you've also got individuals. So यहाँ non-state actors, individuals, and ultimately state officials as well. All of them fall within the remit of international humanitarian law. And international humanitarian law traditionally is understood to protect, civilians, those who are not participating in an armed conflict. During times of war or armed conflict, these are the norms of humanitarian laws, are those which protect non-combatants and civilians during times of armed conflict.
Even combatants to a certain extent. The first Geneva Convention, if I'm not wrong, was for combatants, combatants of war.
First Geneva Convention is for those who are not now actively, combating or who are not actively participating in a conflict any longer. For example, wounded soldiers or those combatants who have now fallen sick. And then that goes on to the Third Geneva Convention protecting prisoners of war, and the Fourth Geneva Convention, which I think is extremely important, and it is exactly what has shaped up our contemporary understanding of international criminal law and international humanitarian law, protection of civilians.
Absolutely.
Not only in times of war, but even in times of armed conflict.
And occupation,
and
even for occupying territories, the Fourth Geneva Convention explicitly lays down an entire code of rights for those civilians who are residing within occupied territories. For instance, Palestine, Kashmir.
Yeah, exactly.
उन पे लगती है Fourth Geneva
Convention. But also now that we've got those two additional protocols, they also ensure that if there is a civil war situation, even internally, the Wahhabi civilians are to be protected. And now, if we are talking about civilians being protected from genocide, from acts of torture, from crimes against humanity, which again has been a very vague term because इसकी भी एक settled definition अभी तक नहीं devise हुई crimes against humanity की, but we can certainly cite examples of what would count as crimes against humanity. So, अब जब internal situations में भी आप कह रहे हो humanitarian law starts applying, that is where the overlap occurs. And also, if you notice, in a way, international rights laws are those which are created through specific treaties, such as I've just mentioned the International Covenants on Human Rights of 1966, or pseudo, or Convention Against Torture. You've got that as well, which has its own enforcement body, the Committee Against Torture. Now, that is a human rights treaty. But if I again go on to say that, committing acts of torture against individuals is a crime against humanity, the same thing then, falls under the wider umbrella of international humanitarian law. So you cannot completely isolate international criminal law from international humanitarian law. And interestingly, in my postgraduate study of human rights, this has been one of the very key topics जिसके ऊपर we have been questioned a lot. Are international human rights law and international humanitarian law mutually exclusive? Can they not apply, simultaneously or contemporaneously? And the answer, if you look at Human Rights Committee, there's a particular general recommendation number 31 of Human Rights Committee, and there's a Lopez case that came ahead of the Human Rights Committee, before Human Rights Committee. They've decided that they are not mutually exclusive.
Yes.
So, states are bound by both international humanitarian law as well as international rights law during times of armed conflict and even extraterritorially. Now, that is very interesting.
Yeah.
That means that, state A could also owe international rights obligations not just to its own citizens, but also to citizens of, for example, state B.
Yes.
But for that, then you have to look at, whether state is exercising jurisdiction over citizens of state B or not. And that, again, opens a completely separate, Pandora's box, paving in way for another, set of aspects which need to be depicted at length. But I hope that you can see from whatever discussion that we've had that there's no simple answer to it. And
absolutely.
Certainly not in yes or no.
Yes, definitely not. I think international law is too vast and too over-encompassing to have a yes or no answer. It's not like domestic law, which says don't rape or don't kill, or, what kind of civil liabilities.
Just again, a brief point though, because, it's been quite much popularized in our own local media as well, and I wanted that to happen, and I'm glad that we're talking about it. If you look at the situation that has been going on in India.
Yes.
Now, we have been talking about Kashmir situation. And within Kashmir, our own Prime Minister and our Foreign Office have said, with which I wholeheartedly agree myself, that, this is a classic Fourth Geneva Convention, Articles 47 and 49.
Indeed.
Where, just as you mentioned, occupied territories and ethnic cleansing is taking place, genocide is taking place, forcible transportation of populations and transfer of population is happening. They are trying to change the demographics in occupied Kashmir. Now, we know that, Kashmir is an internationally designated disputed area.
Yes.
So as much as, the Modi party and BJP party and all his cabinet ministers might try to say that that is an internal issue, that is clearly not. It has been encompassed in 11 Security Council resolutions at least. That is an internationally disputed area. So I think that is still not as great an issue as a lot of others might be. Now, I want to bring another question into this equation, which is, what about the Citizenship Amendment Act? Or what about the love jihad law that has recently been introduced in at least 4 Indian states,
Yes.
Now that is happening in other parts, actually in India, properly speaking, not in Indian occupied Kashmir, not in an internationally disputed area. The Delhi riots happened in Delhi, which is the capital of India.
Yes.
Or, the National Register of Citizens was being compiled in Assam, which is again an integral part of India. Now, do these situations also fall within the remit of international humanitarian law? That is the question. Because if we look at it, and if it is established in a court of law, that is, because prima facie there is a lot of evidence that this is what is going on, and it is something that even NGOs based in India have been saying, that what they're trying to do is they are targeting the Muslim population there.
Yes.
Of course, there are, the Dalits as well, and other, what they call lower caste Hindus. But let's just stick to the Muslim part right now, It is being said that the BJP government is very anti-Muslim in its outlook and in its policies. And
Indeed.
we are seeing that with the Citizenship Amendment Act. We are seeing that with, the riots which took place in February 2020 during Trump's visit. And 52 people, at least 40 Muslims died. And somehow it is the victims who have been charged under the UAPA and are being thrown behind the bars. And the perpetrators are still going free. They're still roaming around free. We look at all these things, love jihad law, which has been introduced, where the mere act of a Muslim man entering into marriage with a Hindu woman in itself gives rise to presumption within that law that, it is a forced conversion. It is a marriage of forced conversion, so just lock the Muslim man up. When we're seeing all of that happen, can we say not only is this a breach of international rights law, but also national law?
It is.
What you're doing is that you're trying to sort of merge the democracy and the dynamics there. You're trying to finish off a particular population, a particular sector of the population. So, could we say that this reflects trade side, for instance? So what my question right now is, and what I would want people to consider is, can international humanitarian law apply internally as well? Or does it only have to be in times of armed conflict? That much we know. The 4 Geneva Conventions minus the additional protocols talk about there having to be a situation of armed conflict. So the answer is quite clear-cut. But then when we get into the territory of the additional protocols, that is exactly where the lines, start becoming blurred.
Again, there are some gray or convoluted areas, as you said, but then there are also some black and white areas too. It really depends upon interpretation. Now, if you would take my opinion, and I think that as far as our discussion has gauged, you would also agree that international humanitarian law should apply internally in situations of ethnic cleansing, genocide, even if it's occurring within a sovereign state's territory, but it should apply, because those civilians or those subjects or citizens should also have that ambit of protection which external populations do in times of armed conflict or occupation. So, because if you're not allowing that ambit, you're actually opening a gateway for a lot of human rights abuse and violations. And we are seeing that today, especially within India, that there is a potential of indirect or implicit ethnic cleansing or genocide occurring against Muslims. And the hostilities are increasing as we speak, which is unfortunate, but it is true. So I think that international lawyers and lawmakers should focus on that. As we're talking about new areas of international law, what new areas of international law do you think that we should focus in the future? For instance, climate change is posing a big problem, and there are talks that we should have an international convention on it. Cybercrime and fifth generation warfare. What other areas do you think that should be included?
This is a fairly broad question, but I do feel that, when we study international law, and you are currently a student as well of international law, in this day and age, I feel that when the UN Charter was framed way back in 1945, there were a lot of things that were not envisaged by the drafters at that particular period. But, given the complexities of the modern world, and again, referring back to the fact that we are in the middle of global pandemic, everything is possible. Recent phenomena which I really don't think international law has provided clear answers to, because like I said, that was not perhaps something which was predicted back then or envisaged back then. But recently I have been reading about, and it's been very much in the news, that there's a major hacking scandal into American state departments, by Russian agents and by Russian intelligence agencies. And also, this whole controversy which came to the fore in relation to Russian in the US presidential 2016 election, which brought Trump to power, or even Brexit referendum, which a lot of people, Cambridge Analytica scandal, which emerged a few years ago, that even within the Brexit referendum, those Leave lobbying groups, they had received a lot of external help, and there was Russian interference allegedly as well. And I feel that in this particular, in this dynamic thing, where you've got, hacking and, being able to use internet and these very complex, complicated digital network systems to interfere in the sovereignty of another nation state. Now, should that also not be considered an act of aggression within Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which prohibits interference into or use of force against another nation state's territorial sovereignty or political independence? Because if this is not encroachment into political independence of a sovereign state, then what is?
Yeah.
That you're basically interfering in and meddling in their internal election system.
Indeed.
Also, that then leads me to new forms of warfare. New forms of warfare. Also, this happened internally in Russia, but the opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who had been administered those Novichok nerve agents, and he'd been poisoned with a nerve agent.
Yes.
And so he had to be taken to Germany to receive, emergency medical treatment. Same thing happened in 2018 in relation to the Salisbury poisonings.
Yes.
Which then resulted in Theresa May, who was the Prime Minister at that time, expelling a lot of Russian ambassadors from the UK, around 23 of them. When these are there are these new weapons, much more complicated, much more, dangerously effective than physical weapons. Are there not new forms of warfare and to immediate proof?
Oh, absolutely they are, and they should be rather categorized as new forms of warfare.
But also you mentioned fifth-generation warfare, and I'm very skeptical about that term. There's nothing wrong, but because it has been hijacked by the right as well. There are a lot of those conspiracists keep on saying that everything is a fifth-generation warfare. So that has sort of tainted the legitimacy of this particular phrase. But to put it another way, information warfare is very reality of the age that we're living in this digital age. Once again, recently, and isn't it scandalous that EU Disinfo Lab has come up with the Indian Chronicles, which has uncovered a very complex network of fake news, pro-Indian fake news, which was being peddled to suit one particular narrative, basically the Indian state narrative, and was concentrated on putting forward an anti-Pakistan narrative, which was completely misleading. This network was set up by the Srivastava group, under which ANI News was operating, and a lot of fake NGOs were operating. And the dangerous thing is that there were a lot of researchers or analysts that I would be looking at on YouTube, speaking in Human Rights Council, and not at all being diplomatic when they would be speaking about Pakistan. And Indian media would be using, and these were European researchers. These were European researchers from European NGOs, and they were speaking out against, Pakistan, or they were saying that why is Pakistan in Human Rights Council? And I thought that one could have an opinion, but the way that this particular speaker is expressing their so-called opinion doesn't look like an opinion. They are trying to state it as a fact in very, undiplomatic black and white terms. That just did not seem to be coming from an object. Extremely off to me about that whole thing. And what EU Disinfo Lab uncovered is that these NGOs, defunct NGOs, their names are being used, and people of dubious reputation were allowed to take the floor on the Human Rights Council sessions, and they were making all those statements, and that added up. Then I understood, so that is the context. that is exactly what seemed off to me when I was watching those videos on YouTube of these, European so-called researchers speaking on India's behalf. This is what was going on. Fake news was being peddled, and not just through websites or the World Wide Web, but also on the floor of,
floor of the United Nations
Council, on the floor of all
Council.
these international summits.
Yes.
Now that is dangerous.
It is very dangerous.
When these elements have infiltrated into European Parliament, they've infiltrated into European Union, they've infiltrated into the Human Rights Council, that, leads to questioning the credibility of all these human rights organizations or international organizations. Then the whole system could break down when there's a trust deficit. So we should know that this is a state of emergency. This is a threat which needs to be tackled.
Dealt with very seriously, that too.
We have to update those laws.
Yes. We talked about Kashmir, and I think as I've come across your interviews, you're very vocal about Kashmir, and it is a very sensitive and close to our heart issue as Pakistanis, and I think even as a human being. How do you think that projecting a more human rights friendly approach by Pakistan or on part of Pakistan's government or state, would it actually help the cause of Kashmir that Pakistan is relentlessly fighting these days, especially?
Again, this question is one which personally intrigues me a lot, which I keep on thinking about a lot, and because I have been on those debates on Indian channels, where basically they are ready to pounce upon any single opportunity which can somehow show that there's unrest, that there's some unrest going on in Pakistan, or there's one particular section of the society which has grievances. Those are the kinds of opportunities that I see Indian media pouncing upon, and then they call Pakistani panelists, and then they try to shame those Pakistani panelists. And so someone in my position would then want that our own internal human rights system should be so good, actually so exemplary, that no one can point fingers at us. And because I know that that would automatically increase the legitimacy of the Pakistani narrative. Now, when the Pakistani narrative is that what is happening in occupied Kashmir is something which needs international attention and international resolution within, purview of international law, I completely agree with it. But if we are asking for, one particular case to be scrutinized by the international UN bodies, automatically attention will also be drawn to us. And in that situation, we need to be prepared that our own system, our own human rights system, our own house needs to be in order. Yeah. And it matters a lot then that every single time, that a particular minority group or women or anyone, from the poor communities, from those who are not as well off as the ruling elite, for example, when they are voicing a grievance or they have certain concerns, I think that those concerns should be paid heed to. They should be taken up, listened, and catered in such a sense that, there might be no discord, in such a way that there is harmony. Now, what I'm trying to explain is an ideal situation. And this sort of ideal situation does not exist anywhere in the world.
Yes.
So I might be expecting a bit too much. That, in Pakistan, everything is in harmony, and because it's not, the world is not a fairyland. We have to, first of all, be prepared for that. Having said that, we can always work on minimizing all sorts of discord. We can always find room for improvement. And just because, particular human rights advocates or particular human rights activists try to bring attention to certain, gloomy or dark areas or certain areas which need more attention and perhaps more sensitivity as well, it doesn't mean that we become defensive to that. That is the time when we enter into dialogue.
Yeah.
Once we enter into dialogue internally and, when all or as much as possible or, grievances are addressed and harmony is restored, that automatically weakens the, stance of anyone who is hostile to our interests.
Indeed.
And that automatically improves our standing internationally, because I am fed up, personally speaking. Whenever I've been on these media channels, they keep on bringing up economy, in a very arrogant manner. Those Indian panelists say, oh, look, our economy is so much better than yours, which actually is untrue, because actually, if we figure in the COVID pandemic as well, India has fared really, really bad in it. And a lot of it is also going to, extremely negligent policies from the BJP government, and there's rising hunger and poverty in that country, which is very bad,
Yes.
which is something that everyone should be sympathetic to. And by the same token, I should say that, the Indian side and those right-wing panelists sitting on Indian media should also refrain from using such language when it comes to the sufferings of those poor people in Pakistan or those farmers in Pakistan who are trying to make ends meet, or those who belong to the lowest thread of society. You can't use it as a tool to taunt one another.
Yeah,
Having said
it's
that,
quite inhuman to do that. And they do
I
it.
think it's a very low blow. And one can't stoop that low. You can't make fun of poor people to just score a political point.
Yes.
But what I was thinking was that, they keep on emphasizing on economic clout. As if it is economic clout and trade relations alone, which the national community needs to rethink, their foreign policy. Where do human rights figure in? Because I remember that, when apartheid was being practiced in South Africa, were there not sanctions imposed there? Have sanctions not been imposed on Russia? And now recently in Hong Kong, where they've got, these new extradition laws and national security laws, where Beijing, not on Hong Kong, but against China, sanctions are being imposed by European Union countries and America, and they are also imposing sanctions on individual officials within the Chinese state apparatus. And also in relation to what is going on with the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. Are they not imposing sanctions there? So does that also not suggest that it is not only trade relations, because China could be a very useful trading partner, if that is the point? It's not only about the economy, it's not, and it should not be only about trade relations. It should also be about human rights.
Yes.
If a particular country is not, for example, living up to the expected human rights standards, then I'm sorry, international reaction has to follow. And for that, every single country will have to be at their best. And because I'm Pakistani, it matters a lot. We should be at our best, definitely. And at the same time, I am very glad that we are talking about it, what has been going on in Kashmir. I think that this topic had remained neglected for very long.
Yes.
After Article 370 had been revoked by the Modi government. I think it really brought much more attention and much more urgency to this whole topic.
Indeed.
Unfortunately, the enforcement mechanisms are very limited, and I would want to talk about that now. So please ask me something about how to resolve this Kashmir dispute. What are the mechanisms available?
Well,
I really want
for starters, I think that we all need to actually implement the resolutions and the international instruments that are available to us. And the UNSC, the Union Security Council, needs to take up this issue as a matter of urgency, and we cannot ignore the politics that does take place within the United Nations Security Council. Having said that, it is now, if you look at the Kashmiri plight at the moment, it is now that time that the United Nations Security Council needs to assert that power and prove that the United Nations is there to protect human rights and not just, gauge for political interests.
Now, that's correct. That's the thing. You've just said Security Council should take up this matter, and you're absolutely right. But unfortunately, now within Security Council, there's a lot of international politics and, alliances which figure into the equation, which then means, the power of veto which permanent Security Council members have. That comes in handy when someone wants to hide their human rights abuse. And by someone here, I mean the Indian state.
The Indians, yeah.
So, they are so much more closer to at least 3 states in the Security Council. I could definitely name, out of them, I could name 2, United States and France. Not that Pakistan isn't. Pakistan has been in a close ally with the United States on the war on terror. But because of the economic relations that India has enjoyed, and with France, we know the Rafale jet deal that they had with France as well. They're much more closer. It just takes one state, within the Security Council to pass a veto. Pakistan is more closely allied at the moment with China. So when, we figure in this international political power play, it means the Security Council is handicapped. So where else do we look for resolution? Is it the International Court of Justice? Is it the International Criminal Court? Now, let me speak, let me talk about, International Court of Justice.
I was just going to come to that. मैंने यही पूछना था कि International Criminal Court, we have one, and it has both it has limited scope, but it does have power as well at the same time. So how efficaciously do you think that the International Criminal Court can resolve this dispute, for that matter?
Good. So you see, why International Criminal Court? That is the first question that I would ask you, actually counter question that I would ask myself as well. And why not International Court of Justice? There's a major limitation when it comes to International Court of Justice for people who do not know that.
Yes.
With respect to ICJ, unfortunately, reservation that whatever might have with Pakistan, ICJ will have jurisdiction over it. So Pakistan cannot bring its Kashmir dispute with India to the ICJ. Interestingly, in 2019, which was very much reported in the mainstream media as well, brought genocide claims against Myanmar, what they have been doing with the Rohingya community there. What if, a third country, for example, a country with respect to which India has not entered a reservation to ICJ's jurisdiction, what if a third country brings, genocide claims, for example, against India? Just at the prima facie, it seems that if you look at Articles 47 and 49, people are being locked up under the FSPA, under UAPA. Those in Kashmiri activists are being locked up. They're being thrown behind bars. There's a lockdown. Communications networks have been turned off. And it is an open prison for those who are not technically in prison. And acts of torture have been documented. Now, I'm not saying that. Amnesty International,
Human Rights Watch, ICRC, you name it. All of them have talked about it.
So when there is prima facie evidence, if Pakistan cannot bring, owing to a reservation, if Pakistan cannot directly bring such a claim to the ICJ, can a third country not do so? And the third country, which, for example, Pakistan could have good relations. Now, that is something which needs to be explored. Because in relation to the Rohingya community, the genocide claims which are lying before the ICJ, it's been postponed to, I believe, May 2021, the final decision of the ICJ. So, all eyes are on that. It's the test case. Then brings me to the International Criminal Court. I'm not sure whether many would agree with me, and there are many learned international law experts who might be watching this program. But, some have pondered a lot on this. And the conclusion, as near to conclusion that I can get, I've reached is that the International Criminal Court is an effective mechanism for Pakistan. This might be an unpopular opinion, but I'll tell you. Exercises jurisdiction what we've been doing, international humanitarian law or international criminal law, which means acts of aggression, crimes against humanity, torture, genocide.
War crimes, yes.
Now, torture, as I said, has been documented very well in Indian-occupied Kashmir. Genocide, I said, prima facie established because they've introduced new laws which are affecting a population change and a demographic change within Indian-occupied Kashmir. So prima facie, that is also being established.
No, but even if you look at the Rome Statute of the ICC, under Article 8, there are actually around 15 to 20 sub-articles from sub-article A to H, or I think it even goes beyond that. An extensive criteria of crimes against humanity have been outlined within that, and all the acts that are being perpetrated by the Indian military in
Kashmir. Crimes against humanity crimes against humanity were defined for the first time in the Nuremberg trials.
Yes.
In fact, so like I said, be it torture, be it enforced disappearances, be it, forced pregnancies or sterilization. Again, these are the kinds of things which happen by Kashmir. I'm saying of the side, there is enough evidence to at least lodge these cases with the prosecutor of the ICC, Fatou Bensouda.
Yes.
Now, the interesting thing is that international criminal matters over which it exercises jurisdiction, those are rated, more or less. But how does the ICC gain jurisdiction? Much more flexibility to it as compared to the ICJ. So, for ICC to exercise jurisdiction over a crime against humanity or genocide or torture or whichever of these things it is, The only thing is that you need to be a state party to the Rome Statute of International Court.
Yes.
If something has happened on your territory, among other things, if a crime against humanity has taken place in your country, or if an act of genocide or any of those acts for which the ICC has jurisdiction, if any of those acts have taken place on a state party's territory, the state party bring claims against all individuals who are associated with such crimes. Now, here's the presenting you. 13th November, ceasefire violation occurred on LOC.
Yes.
Just last week, there were reports of a observation group, observatory group. They have been attacked through firing from across the LOC.
Yes.
Civilians, through repeated and incessant actions along the LOC, have lost their lives, have been injured and wounded, and their homes have been destroyed in our part of Azad Kashmir.
Yes.
When civilians are attacked, is that not a crime against humanity?
It is. It absolutely is.
Within the Geneva Convention,
Did
that not take place on Pakistani territory?
It did.
When something takes place on Pakistani territory, and if Pakistan becomes state party to the ICC, Pakistan would easily be able to bring this to the attention of the ICC prosecutor from where it. Now you see that is much more than lobbying in the Security Council or waiting for a favorable response. Completely capped by the veto power being exercised, resolutions being passed in General Assembly. This would be, I believe, a much more not quick, but I think much more time-effective way of. In that way, what could happen is that those atrocities which have been taking place and hostilities which take place on part of Kashmir from the Indian forces breathe fire of the LOC. That same equation could be brought going on in Indian-occupied Kashmir as well. Provide the context of what India in state is doing, and that could bring automatic global international legal attention to the situation in Kashmir as the ceasefire violations taking place here, an issue which has already been internationalized owing to what happened in Balakot, retaliated. Issue would be further internationalized, much to the chagrin, much to the distress of the Indian government and the Indian state apparatus. This issue would be internationalized even further, and perhaps there could be some way forward for international legal resolution to this long-standing dispute. Because, before we move on to the next stage of our discussion, recently the Rohingya situation has also come to the attention of the International Court.
Yes.
And now, how did that happen? Myanmar is not a state party to the ICC, but Bangladesh, where all those Rohingyas have been, transported.
Yes.
Bangladesh is a state party.
Yeah.
So that happened on Bangladeshi territory. They were able to bring the matter to the ICC's attention. This is what I mean. Also, what has been going on with Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, China, that has recently been brought to the ICC prosecutor's attention. Why? China is not a state party to the ICC because other neighboring countries, they are state parties. And Uyghur Muslims from those neighboring countries were taken to China and in those, labor camps.
No, it's very interesting the way the ICC operates. It actually is. But unfortunately, we're running out of time, and I would like to conclude here by saying that this was a very enlightening and engaging discussion, and hopefully we would be able to see a resolution of Kashmir and the implementation of human rights within our country. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. Thank you. Allah Hafiz.